Somewhere over eastern Pennsylvania, in the winter of 1930, a United Airlines Boeing 80A was carrying 12 passengers through cloud cover, so thick the pilot couldn't see his own wingtips. He'd left Chicago 4 hours earlier. No one on the ground had heard from him since. No one expected to. There was no authority tracking his position, no controller monitoring his altitude, no system at all to confirm whether the aircraft was still airborne or already scattered across a frozen hillside. The passengers read their newspapers. The pilot watched for breaks in the clouds. And in Newark, a station agent checked his watch, made a note, and waited. This was commercial aviation in the United States, not the infancy of flight, not the experimental years when the Wright brothers were still tinkering at Kitty Hawk. This was 1930. The industry had paying customers, published schedules, and routes stretching from coast to coast. What it didn't have was anyone in charge of the sky. For the next 5 years, American aviation would operate this way. Pilots chose their own altitudes, airlines made their own rules, and the federal government, which regulated railroads and steamships and interstate trucking, looked at the chaos overhead and decided it wasn't Washington's problem. The only laws governing American aviation, as one historian put it, were Isaac Newton's. The passengers boarding that Chicago to Newark flight didn't know they were flying through a regulatory void. They saw uniforms and schedules and the reassuring bulk of a 3-engine biplane. What they couldn't see was the improvisation holding it together. The pilot navigating by railroad tracks. The dispatcher in Chicago who'd lost contact the moment the plane crossed Indiana. The complete absence of anyone empowered to tell 2 aircraft approaching the same airspace that they were about to occupy the same point in the sky. How did this happen? How did the most technologically advanced nation on Earth build an aviation industry and forget to build a system to manage it? The answer isn't incompetence, it's something stranger. The men who ran early American aviation were competent, often brilliant. They knew the risks, they built workarounds. And for years, those workarounds held. The crashes that came, and crashes did come, were dismissed as pilot error, weather, mechanical failure. Anything but a systemic problem requiring a systemic solution. What finally broke the system wasn't a single disaster. It was arithmetic. Traffic doubled, routes converged. And on an August afternoon in 1935, 2 aircraft found each other over the Allegheny Mountains in a way that made it impossible for Washington to look away any longer. But that collision is still 5 years in the future. To understand why it took corpses to build a bureaucracy, you have to understand what the pilots were flying through in 1930, and why anyone thought this was acceptable. The transcontinental airmail route was the spine of American commercial aviation. It ran from New York to San Francisco, roughly following the path of the railroads, and it was marked in a way that seems almost primitive now. Every 10 miles, the post office had built a beacon, a rotating light, visible for 40 miles on a clear night, mounted on a steel tower. Below the beacon, a 70-foot concrete arrow, painted bright yellow, pointed toward the next station. The idea was simple. A pilot flying at night could hop from beacon to beacon, following the arrows, and eventually reach his destination. During the day, pilots used what they called the iron compass, the railroad tracks below. You could follow the Union Pacific from Omaha to Cheyenne, the Pennsylvania Railroad from New York to Pittsburgh, and never need to consult a chart. The tracks didn't lie. They didn't drift with the wind, and in an era when aircraft instruments were unreliable and radio navigation was experimental, a pilot who could see the ground could find his way home. This was contact flying. It worked beautifully in clear weather. It worked acceptably in light cloud, and it failed completely when the ceiling dropped below the mountains, or the fog rolled in off the Great Lakes, or a winter storm turned Pennsylvania into a gray void extending from the ground to 10,000 feet. The passengers on that 1930 flight were experiencing contact flying at its most routine. 4 hours of silence. No radio check-ins, because most aircraft didn't carry radios capable of air-to-ground communication. No flight following, because no agency existed to follow flights. The pilot knew where he was. The airline assumed he'd arrive. And if he didn't, they'd send someone to look for him in the morning. Consider what this meant in practice. An aircraft leaving Chicago for Newark was on its own the moment it left the ground. The pilot carried a compass, an altimeter, a clock, and a map. He watched the landscape scroll beneath him. He looked for landmarks, cities, rivers, the distinctive bend of a railroad line approaching a junction. When clouds blocked his view, he climbed above them or descended below them, or, if neither was possible, he found a field and landed to wait out the weather. This last option was common enough that the airlines built it into their schedules. A weather delay in 1930 often meant a pilot sitting in an Iowa cornfield waiting for the fog to lift. The altitude question was even stranger. In 1930, there was no authority assigning altitudes to commercial aircraft. None. A pilot flying east at 6,000 feet might encounter a pilot flying west at the same altitude on the same airway with no warning and no coordination. The informal convention, which eventually became regulation, was eastbound traffic flying at odd thousands, westbound at even. But in 1930, it was just a convention. Some pilots followed it, some didn't, and there was no one to enforce it. The transcontinental airmail route ran through terrain that punished improvisation. West of Chicago, the pilots crossed the Great Plains, where the landmarks were sparse and the weather came in fast. In Nebraska, they picked up the Platte River and followed it toward the Rockies. The crossing at Cheyenne was 6,000 feet above sea level. Beyond it, the route climbed through mountain passes where the clouds could close in without warning and the terrain rose faster than an overloaded mail plane could climb. The eastbound crossing was worse in some ways. The Allegheny Mountains, running through Pennsylvania and West Virginia, weren't as high as the Rockies, but they were often invisible. Fog pooled in the valleys. Cloud layers stacked from ridgeline to ridgeline. A pilot who lost visual contact with the ground over the Alleghenies was flying blind through terrain that offered no margin for error. The beacon lights were useless in cloud. The concrete arrows were useless in cloud. And the radio, if the aircraft had one, could tell you the weather at your destination but not the position of the mountain 200 feet in front of your propeller. The men who flew these routes were not reckless. They were, by the standards of any era, extraordinarily skilled. They learned the weather patterns over specific mountain passes. They memorized the positions of water towers and grain elevators that could confirm their location when the visibility dropped. They developed personal rules about when to press on and when to turn back. Some of those rules were shared, most were not. Two pilots flying the same route might make entirely different decisions about the same weather conditions, and both might be right or both might be wrong, and no one had the authority to standardize the call. This was the operational reality the federal government chose not to regulate. The Air Commerce Act of 1926 had given the Department of Commerce authority over aviation safety. The department had used that authority to license pilots, certify aircraft, and investigate crashes. What it hadn't done was build a system to manage traffic in the air. The official position was that the airlines could handle it themselves. Private enterprise, self-regulation, the same logic that had allowed railroad companies to build their own signaling systems and steamship lines to set their own navigation rules. The difference was the consequences of failure. A railroad collision killed the people on the trains. A steamship sinking killed the people on the ship. But two aircraft colliding over a populated area could scatter wreckage across a town that had nothing to do with aviation. And as the traffic increased, as the routes converged over cities and the airspace above major airports grew crowded, the arithmetic of risk began to shift. By 1935, it was common to have 15 aircraft circling a single airport simultaneously, waiting for clearance to land. The pilots communicated with the ground by radio when they had radios. They communicated with each other not at all. The approach sequence was a negotiation conducted in real time, each pilot watching for the others, judging distances, making assumptions about who would land first and who would go around. It worked, most of the time. And the times it didn't work were called accidents, attributed to pilot error, and filed away in folders that no one outside the industry ever read. The question that opens this story, the question that hung over American aviation for nearly 2 decades, is why Washington accepted this. The crashes were reported in the newspapers. The near misses were known within the industry. The pilots themselves, the men who flew the routes and knew the risks, were not quiet about what they saw. So why did it take until 1935 for the federal government to intervene? Part of the answer is political. Aviation in the 1920s and early 1930s was a symbol of American ingenuity, private enterprise conquering the frontier of the sky. The men who built the airlines were celebrated as visionaries. Regulation was for industries that had failed. Aviation hadn't failed. It was growing. Passengers were boarding flights in numbers that doubled every few years. The mail was getting through. The crashes, tragic as they were, could be framed as the cost of progress, acceptable losses in a young industry still learning its limits. Part of the answer is technical. A traffic control system requires communication, and the radio technology of the early 1930s was unreliable, expensive, and not yet standardized. It requires tracking, and radar wouldn't exist for another decade. It requires a network of stations and controllers and protocols, and building that network costs money that someone has to pay. The airlines didn't want to pay. The government didn't want to spend. So the sky stayed unmanaged, and the men who flew it developed their own systems. Those systems were remarkable. They were also fragile. And they depended entirely on a small group of men who knew each other, trusted each other, and understood that a phone call between dispatchers in Kansas City and Newark might be the only thing standing between two aircraft and the same patch of sky. The airline dispatch office in 1932 was a room full of telephones and paper. No radar screens, no computer terminals, just men with pencils and maps and a direct line to every station on the route. When a flight left Chicago, the dispatcher in Chicago called the dispatcher in Cleveland, Cleveland called Pittsburgh, Pittsburgh called Newark. The calls established a chain of awareness. Everyone knew roughly where the aircraft was, roughly when it would arrive, roughly what altitude it was flying. The system worked because the dispatchers knew each other. American Airlines, TWA, United, they were competitors in the market and collaborators in the air. If a TWA flight was approaching Kansas City in bad weather, the TWA dispatcher would call his counterpart at American and ask what their pilot had reported. If an American flight was running late into Newark, the American dispatcher would call United and ask them to hold their departure for 10 minutes. These were gentlemen's agreements, handshake deals, professional courtesies extended between men who understood that the alternative was everyone taking their chances. Jack Fry ran TWA's operations during these years, and he ran them with a rigor that other airlines noticed. Fry was a pilot himself. He'd flown the mail routes, crossed the mountains, experienced the weather that killed careless men. When he took over TWA's operations, he instituted what he called the flight plan system. Before every departure, pilots had to document their exact route, their fuel requirements, their alternate airports, the decision points where they'd turn back if conditions deteriorated. This was revolutionary. Other airlines operated on intuition. Fry operated on paper. The system worked because traffic was thin. In 1932, there might be a dozen commercial flights a day crossing the Alleghenies. The dispatchers could track them all. The pilots could see each other, most of the time, and steer around each other. The gentlemen's agreements held because the stakes were manageable and the relationships were personal. But the traffic was doubling. By 1934, those dozen flights had become 2 dozen. By 1935, there were moments when the approaches to Newark or Chicago looked like holding patterns at modern airports, except without the controllers, without the radar, without anyone on the ground who could see the full picture. The dispatchers were still calling each other. The gentlemen's agreements were still in place. But the system was straining, and the question that no one wanted to ask was what happened when it broke. The men who ran the dispatch offices knew the answer. They'd seen the near misses. They'd taken the calls where a pilot reported another aircraft passing close enough to read the tail number. They'd done the math. Sooner or later, 2 aircraft would find each other at the same altitude on the same route, and neither pilot would see the other in time. What they couldn't know was when, or where, or which 2 aircraft. So they kept making calls, kept tracking flights, kept hoping that the system they'd built from telephones and trust would hold a little longer. It held until August 1935. The morning of August 17, 1935, was clear over most of Pennsylvania, the kind of morning that made pilots confident, maybe too confident. 2 aircraft took off from opposite ends of the country, each following its company's procedures exactly, each invisible to the other. The TWA flight was a Douglas DC-2, one of the most modern aircraft in American skies. It had departed Los Angeles the night before, making stops along the way, carrying passengers who'd paid premium fares for the fastest coast-to-coast service available. The United flight was a Boeing 247, smaller but reliable, heading west out of Newark with its own manifest of paying customers. Both aircraft were navigating the same way pilots had navigated for years: radio range beams for general direction, visual landmarks for precision, and the assumption that other aircraft would see them and steer clear. The Alleghenies that morning were what the Alleghenies always were: ridgelines rising and falling like frozen waves, valleys that could hide weather, terrain that demanded attention. Both aircraft were flying at roughly the same altitude, converging on the same airspace from different directions. The TWA dispatcher in Kansas City knew where his aircraft was. The United dispatcher in Chicago knew where his aircraft was, but no one knew where both aircraft were, because there was no one whose job it was to know. The collision happened in seconds. Somewhere over the Pennsylvania ridgelines, the 2 aircraft found each other. There was no radio call, no warning, no moment of recognition. Just 2 machines that had been invisible to each other suddenly occupying the same patch of sky that could only hold one. Everyone aboard both aircraft died. The wreckage fell into the mountains, scattered across terrain so rugged that the recovery crews struggled for days to reach all of it. The bodies had to be carried out on stretchers over ridgelines that barely allowed foot traffic. The investigators who came later found pieces of both aircraft mixed together, metal fragments that told the story of an impact so sudden that neither pilot could have had time to react. The cruelest part was this: both crews had done everything right. The TWA pilots had filed their flight plan, followed their route, maintained their altitude exactly as company procedures required. The United pilots had done the same, Both dispatch offices had tracked their flights, made their phone calls, followed the gentlemen's agreements that had kept the system running for years. The system hadn't failed. The system had worked perfectly, and the system had killed everyone aboard both aircraft, because the system had no mechanism for preventing two aircraft from being in the same place at the same time. This was the structural irony that the men who ran the dispatch offices had always understood and never wanted to face. The rules worked until they didn't. The phone calls and the flight plans and the informal coordination created an illusion of safety, but the illusion depended on luck. Eventually, the luck would run out. On August 17th, 1935, it did. The newspaper coverage was extensive. Two commercial airliners colliding in midair was unprecedented. The public, which had been slowly warming to the idea of air travel, suddenly remembered why they'd been afraid of it. The airlines, which had been growing fast and making money, suddenly faced questions they couldn't answer. How could this happen? Why wasn't someone in charge? Who was supposed to prevent this? The answers were uncomfortable. This could happen because there was nothing preventing it. No one was in charge because the government had decided not to be in charge, and the airlines had decided they could manage themselves. The only people who were supposed to prevent this were the dispatchers making phone calls to each other, and the dispatchers had done everything they could. The system wasn't broken. The system was simply inadequate for what aviation had become. The months after the collision were a study in how Washington responds to tragedy. There was outrage, certainly. Speeches were made, investigations were launched, reports were written, but outrage doesn't build infrastructure. It doesn't hire controllers or design procedures or allocate funding. The same forces that had prevented federal air traffic control before the collision were still in place after it. The airlines didn't want government interference. The government didn't want to spend money during a depression. And the Bureau of Air Commerce, which theoretically had jurisdiction, had no budget and no mandate to do anything about en route traffic. Eugene L. Vidal was the director of Air Commerce in 1935, and he understood the politics better than most. Vidal had been a pilot himself, an Olympic athlete, a man who moved comfortably between the aviation industry and the government offices that regulated it. He knew that a federal air traffic control system would take years to build and fund, years that the airlines couldn't afford to wait. So he proposed something that made no theoretical sense, but perfect practical sense. The airlines would build the system themselves. The logic was cold, but effective. The airlines were the ones facing lawsuits when aircraft crashed. The airlines were the ones losing customers when headlines screamed about mid-air collisions. The airlines had every incentive to make the system safer, because the alternative was paying for the wreckage in court. Vidal's proposal was simple. The major carriers would pool their resources, fund a traffic control operation, and staff it with their own people. The government would provide oversight eventually, but the industry would provide the money and the personnel now. On December 1st, 1935, 3.5 months after the Alleghenies collision, the first Airway Traffic Control Center opened in Newark, New Jersey. The facility was not what anyone would recognize as an air traffic control center today. It was a room with tables, telephones, and improvised equipment. The controllers tracked aircraft using cardboard strips on which they wrote flight information by hand. They moved markers across tabletop maps using broom handles, pushing little pieces of cardboard to represent aircraft they couldn't see and couldn't contact directly. The controllers had no radio link to the pilots they were tracking. When they needed to issue instructions, they called the airline dispatchers, who called the airport towers, who relayed the information to the aircraft by radio. A clearance that today takes seconds required a chain of telephone calls that could take minutes. But for the first time in American aviation history, someone was watching the whole sky. Someone was tracking aircraft from multiple airlines on the same map, looking for conflicts, issuing instructions to prevent two aircraft from occupying the same airspace. The men who worked in that Newark center were inventing their profession as they went. There was no manual, no training program, no established procedure for controlling en route traffic. They made decisions, saw what worked, and wrote it down. The clearance procedures that govern modern aviation descended from the improvised rules those men developed in the winter of 1935 and 1936. They were airline employees, paid by the companies whose aircraft they were controlling, working in a facility funded by the industry rather than the government. William Conrad, who worked in those early centers, described the era with characteristic bluntness. There was no controlling air traffic back then, he said later. It was a free-for-all, a half-assed operation. But it worked. The acknowledgement captured something important. The system was imperfect, improvised, underfunded, and inadequate by any modern standard. But it was also the first attempt to impose order on the American sky, and it did prevent collisions. Not perfectly, not elegantly, but effectively enough that the airlines saw value in continuing to fund it. The industry-funded experiment lasted 7 months. In July 1936, the Bureau of Air Commerce assumed control of the centers. absorbing the personnel and procedures that the airlines had developed. The transition was bureaucratic, gradual, and anticlimactic, but it marked a fundamental shift. For the first time, the federal government was responsible for separating aircraft in American airspace. The airlines had built the system, but they couldn't keep it. The liability was too great, the conflicts of interest too obvious. Sooner or later, the government had to take over. The culmination came with the Civil Aeronautics Act of 1938, which created the Civil Aeronautics Authority and established the regulatory framework that would govern American aviation for decades. The act gave the federal government clear authority over air traffic control, airline routes, and safety standards. It was the system that the 1926 Air Commerce Act had failed to create, built 12 years later on a foundation of wreckage and lawsuits. There's a temptation to tell this story as triumph. The chaos of the early years gave way to the order of federal regulation. The deaths of passengers and crew in the Alleghenies forced Washington to act. The system that emerged saved lives, enabled growth, and made possible the aviation network that connects the modern world. All of that is true, but it's not the whole truth. The system exists because it was cheaper than the alternative. The airlines funded the first centers because litigation was expensive and dead passengers were bad for business. The government took over because the political cost of another collision exceeded the budgetary cost of regulation. The dead built the bureaucracy, but not because anyone felt their deaths keenly enough to act on principle. The system emerged from calculation, not conscience, and there's something else worth noting. For the first year of its existence, the system that was supposed to constrain the airlines was funded and staffed by the airlines themselves. The controllers who tracked TWA flights were paid by TWA. The procedures they developed had to satisfy their employers before they satisfied the public. The modern air traffic control system descended from this arrangement. It carries the genes of an industry that built safety infrastructure only when forced to, funded by the companies it was supposed to regulate. Is that a scandal? Or is it just how systems get built in the real world, where money moves faster than principle and liability concentrates the mind better than mortality? The sky you fly through today is the answer. Controlled, coordinated, tracked by radar and satellite and computer systems that would have seemed like magic to the dispatchers making phone calls in 1932. Aircraft don't find each other anymore, not in American airspace, not unless something has gone terribly wrong. The system works. The question is whether you find comfort in that, or whether you find it troubling that it took so many deaths to build something that should have been obvious from the start. The men who flew the bonfires, who followed the railroad tracks, who trusted their lives to phone calls between dispatchers in different cities, they were not fools. They understood the risks. They did the best they could with what they had, but what they had was never enough. And the system that replaced their improvised arrangements was built not by visionaries who saw a better way, but by bureaucrats and lawyers and accountants who saw what the old way was costing. That's the story of how the American sky got controlled, not a story of progress, a story of pressure, of death-forcing change that prudence should have made obvious, of an industry that waited until the wreckage was undeniable, and a government that waited until the industry couldn't wait any longer. The next time you look out an airplane window and see another aircraft passing safely in the distance, know that the separation between you exists because men and women in darkened rooms are watching, tracking, coordinating your flight with every other flight in your airspace. And know that those rooms exist because, on a clear August morning in 1935, two aircraft found each other over the Alleghenies and no one on the ground could see it coming.